Good afternoon or good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture in the series of poetry lectures we have in the Center of Advanced Studies, Poetry in Transition. We are very honored to have this series of poetry lectures this semester because actually the university decides every semester on a special topic, but this semester we have poetry, which is of course connected to our Center of Advanced Studies focusing on Russian poetry in transition. Today we have a very special guest, a poet from, I should not say from, but a Chinese poet called Lian. If you wonder which is the family name is Yang, and Lian is the surname. Just a few words about him. He actually has a very interesting life with a lot of changes, very surprising changes. He was actually born not in China, but in Switzerland, but then grew up in China, in Beijing, and experienced, for example, the Cultural Revolution also in a quite poetic way. I don't know whether we will talk about this later. Then he became one of the famous group of Misty poets in the 1980s. This was a major trend in Chinese poetry, in Chinese modern poetry at this time. And actually got already some small problems with the ruling class due to the contents of some of his poems. Then he was outside China for a couple of times, and just when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened in 1989, he happened to be abroad. So he witnessed it from outside and was temporarily unavailable. It was impossible for him to come back. He then got a New Zealand passport and started to live in London. And since a couple of years he has moved to Berlin, which is his current residence. He has published many poetry volumes. He just told us that he is basically only writing in Chinese, so this is actually very special because some authors in diaspora start to get influenced by foreign languages and also try something else, but he is still very much rooted in the Chinese languages. Now he has won a lot of prizes. I don't want to list them all, but most importantly he was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature. So his lecture will be in what we call English. He calls it Yanglish, as he said. But we have announced the lecture in German, but I think it's no problem that he will talk to us in English. We also will appreciate this. So his poems, however, will be read by himself in Chinese language, and we have asked Professor Kraushaar to read German translations. So that's how we will proceed, and I don't want to waste too much of your time, and I'm looking forward to your talk. Please.
Well, thank you very much. Trier for me, it should be a familiar place. 23 years ago, when I moved from Stuttgart to London, I drove my little opera cadet. Wanted to come to Trier and stay with Karl-Heinz Pohl, professor here in his home, but it was an awfully heavy snow. And then I looked this road to Trier, and then I said, better I leave it. And I may fall into a valley and will never come back. So anyway, I continued to Luxembourg, and then, so this is my first time in 2 years since that snowing experience. Now raining, so that's perfect. Anyway, so now is my time to talk. Back to formal things. 3,300 years ago, the very first name of the whole history of Chinese poetry. The name was Qu Yuan, and had written a greatest, I have to use the word, a greatest poem universally, which titled Question to the Heaven. And in that poem, in that long poem, he will use nearly 200 questions to question from beginning of universe and all the way through the history, the mythology, the history, the reality, and to himself. The very first question in the poem almost like said the beginning of universe. But who said that? Before the upper world and the lower world being separated, how could you prove that? There was the first two questions, and all the way continue. Question deepen the questions, but without answer. And I think that poem actually addressed the very image of poet forever, the questioner. And Qu Yuan himself, after all, had been sent to exile by the king and finally drowned himself in the river. And the first questioner with a profound awareness actually also show or point the fate of the questioners. So my first question today is, today where are we? Where is the poetry? Today we are so familiar, or maybe too familiar, with one word, violence. But in the 90s, last century, at the early time of my exile, I was in an art center called Yaddo in the upstate of New York, around by the forest. And in that art center, when I walked through the forest, I very often to see the trees had been cut down, and looking those cut trees, the one idea or even one word jumped into my mind: violence. And that becoming the inspirations of the poem we are going to read to you, The Violence in the Forest. I'm going to read Chinese for you first, and my friend, but I don't remember the name yet, friend of poetry, and we'll read the German translation, and translation being made by Wolfgang Kubin, the translator. But anyway, you will hear different translations later. But this one, 森林中的暴力，纠缠的被扭断的脖子上，天空竖起帆梁，口号还在冒烟，天空已开始吃肉，树林低下头，而天空远远的笑，木桩堆着，天空忘记了。这是你每天看见的暴力，群居的绿色的脚，一阵死寂又一阵死寂的走向死后，听到天空满意的在背后填土，雷雨把你变成一块湿漉漉的案板，刀剁在腰上，多么悦耳！阳光的唱针划破年轮，不再刺耳。树身努力接近了废弃的事实，这是每天的暴力。天空砍伐森林，因为它正变成人，因为人每天不流血，向你欣赏着，宁静中自己不停地抽搐。 就是每天。
I do prefer to stand reading. Die Gewalt in den Wäldern. Der Himmel schlägt den Kragen hoch, verstrickt in umgedrehte Hälse. Die Slogans rauchen noch, da beginnt er mit dem Fleischverzehr. Die Wälder senken das Haupt, er aber lächelt aus der Ferne. Die Pfähle sind gestapelt, der Himmel hat es vergessen. Dies ist die Gewalt, die du täglich siehst. Herdenweise grüne Füße, Totenstille für Totenstille laufen sie dem Tod hinterdrein. Sie hören den Himmel, zufrieden füllen sie hinterrücks Erde auf. Gewitter machen dich zu einem triefenden Hackbrett. Wie angenehm ist dem Ohr ein Messer, das die Hüfte trifft. Der Sonnensaphir zerkratzt Jahresringe, es schmerzt keinem Ohr mehr. Die Baumstämme sind mit machtverworfenem Faktum nahegerückt. Dies ist die tägliche Gewalt. Der Himmel fällt die Wälder, da er gerade zum Menschen wird, denn ein Mensch blutet nicht jeden Tag. So wie du genießt das unaufhörlich eigene Zucken in der Stille. So ist das täglich.
Thank you. Well, have you paid attention of every day? Today. This is the reality of every person. But this is also the place where it stands for poetry today. We experience the Cold War, the post-Cold War, the globalization, the commercialized world. And today, these slogans of black or white, which separated during the Cold War era, has no meaning at all. Today, the reality is what? Is this? One Apple phone. The Apple phone is an example of producing by the cheap Chinese labor, the Taiwanese boss of the factory, the American label, the global profits. And this is the reality, is so close to everybody. It's not far away there, but it is here. And therefore, one totally confused logic, which is between the confused value system, the vacuum of human mind, the selfish and the cynical attitude, and finally, nothing but scratch the immediate interest in the front of our eyes, becoming the common attitude and situation everywhere. And in my memory, this is the deepest spiritual crisis in human being for a whole time. So my second question is, today, is poetry still exist? And what's the meaning it has? I want to mention one name I guess you maybe all know, Ai Weiwei, who live in Berlin, and my friend, and well, his name is quite often showing everywhere. If you have any time, this big magazine is called the Lyrik International. You will find a long interview made by me to him. It's called the Arts and Humanity. It's very much recommended to you to read it. And also his quite new documentary, Human Flow. Did you see that? Human Flow? Which is a long documentary, but pushing the problem, the question of refugees, which link with the 65 million people globally to the front of our eyes. And that is very challenging to the old people's thinking and mind about our world today. But one installation he made, you may know, and it's called the sunflower seeds. Is anyone of you hear this? Few? Again, it's a very, very interesting and great artwork. It's 150 tons of sunflower seeds, but all made by porcelain. And each one was hand painted and then made of porcelain. And this 150 tons sunflower seeds is becoming again inspiration of my poem, which I'm going to read later. But this poem was written in 2008, a little bit more than 10 years ago. After, in China, there was one earthquake happened in Wenchuan in Sichuan province. And there was quite many school buildings collapsed during the earthquake, and more than 5,000 kids have been killed by those collapsed the school buildings. And then we went to Sichuan and trying to make the investigations, because the collapsed buildings deeply linked with the corruption of the local officials. And therefore he had been attacked by the local police and later been put into the prison for about half year. And me, not only as an old friend of him, but as the Chinese poet, I feel so odd when I find almost all Chinese artists and the intellectuals been totally silent when he was in jail. And then I wrote this poem, which we are going to read. Is not only about the authorities of China, but it's also about this cold, indifferent mind of the people. And that is somehow, I think, the foundation of this kind of dictator power. And you will realize this poem, every line is in the form of negation. But I hope in the depths of negation, there is something to be confirmed, to confirm the humanity and the human soul in the literature and art. And also in the poem, I mentioned Du Fu, the name of a great Chinese poet during the Tang Dynasty. Again, a wonderful poet, wrote a profound poetry, but based on his exile experience. So the poem in English translation, the title is Refusing to Let This Poem Sink into That Indifferent Beauty. Okay, I read the Chinese first.
一粒葵花籽儿的否定句，致艾未未。不能想象，这瓷质的江水中， 曾驳着杜甫的偏正。我不认识月光，只看见诗句的皎洁在一行行衰减至无人，至象征。谈论一切，又回避一切。我不是象征，死在一粒葵花籽儿硬壳下的太阳也不是。孩子们雪白坍塌的肉并没有消失。一条破晓的地平线，不可能忘了那阵疼。骨头被玻璃切开时，像玻璃，来不及叫喊，才不得不在每天的曙光中叫喊。一场地震不会停止，一种窒息不在死后，纵直到天边的栅栏，靠着更难堪的沉默。因此我不怕。年轻女警察审视我的裸体，她被烧制成型，和你的并无区别。不知道别的罪，除了10000次加深自己的罪，不落进泥土，只落进流不动的江水中。不在乎石头含着的金黄，得继续含着，像滴杜甫的老泪。不让这首诗沉沦为冷漠死寂的美。
Negationssätze eines Sonnenblumenkerns. Für Ai Weiwei. Kann mir nicht vorstellen, dass auf diesem Porzellanfluss einmal Dufus kleines Boot vertaut war. Ich kenne das Mondlicht nicht, sehe nur das mondklare Leuchten der Verse, das mit jeder Zeile schwächer wird. Zum Nichtmenschen, zu einem Symbol. Alles diskutierend und alles vermeidend. Ich bin kein Symbol. Die Sonne, die unter der harten Schale eines Sonnenblumenkerns stirbt, ist auch nicht das schneeweiße, eingestürzte Fleisch von Kindern. Bin auch nicht verschwunden. Der Streifen Horizont bei Tagesanbruch hat unmöglich diesen Schmerz vergessen. Von Glas zerschnittene Knochen wie Glas. Konnte nicht schreien und musste dann bei jedem Sonnenaufgang schreien. Ein Erdbeben kann nicht stillstehen. Ein Ersticken kommt nicht nach dem Tod. Verpflanzt Zäune ans Ende der Welt, wo das unerträgliche Schweigen angekettet ist. Deshalb fürchte ich nicht die junge Polizistin, die meine Nacktheit inspiziert. Im Feuer geschmiedet, nicht anders als deine. Kenne keine anderen Scherben als die 100-Millionenfachen Scherben tief in mir drin. Sie fallen nicht in die Erde, nur in den Fluss, der nicht fließt, sich nicht schert um das Gold in den Steinen, weitermacht, zurückhält, wie eine Träne des alten Dufu. Dieses Gedicht nicht in gleichgültige, tote Schönheit sinken lässt.
Well, the history is not ending. And to me, the open gate of the checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, it was marked the ending of the Cold War era. But the closed gate of the new Berlin walls everywhere in the world is marked the beginning of a new era of closed mind. In the United States, in Hungarian, in Israel, you'll see that everywhere. The
hopeless situation of the mind, the difficult situation everywhere, to me is deeper than the Cold War time. And we have no ideal and we have no way out. So my third question, who is not in exile? My home in London, and in the backyard, there are few apple trees. One evening in November, I think it was 4 years after I moved to London, and that evening I looked through the window in my kitchen to the trees, and my eyes was searching something. And then I was searching the last apple hanging on that branch and in that tree, and I find it. And this foreign apple, and suddenly become a Newton's apple to me, because that showed me the gravity of the poet's spirits and his awareness about the difficult situation. And also the awareness means the transcendence of the situation. And near our home in London, there is quite well-known place called Lee Valley, where the original marshland have been reserved. And this local place, actually marked my meaning, the feeling and the meaning of international, this word, to me. And the next poem I'm going to read to you is titled Stroller, which is based on what I walked through this marshland, but not only walked on the surface of land, but walked layer by layer, depth by depth, into my life and into my memory. And this is the poem I'm going to read. Next one. Please pay attention on the translation. I hope that's toward and toward and toward to somewhere. Okay. 散步者，水下的金鱼是否会歌唱一座城市的兴衰？河边一排钻研羽毛的天鹅是否在刻画揽镜自照的少女？风声灌满了她散步的自我。被黑暗中一条街领着，到这片沼泽里，脚陷下1寸深，绿漫出堤岸，熟读冬天的无奈。一场雨后，草叶破碎的膝盖到处跪着。一块云虚构一次日食，它在地平线远眺中忽明忽暗。繁衍有只雁叫过的整整一夜。到这个遗忘里，感觉被河谷温柔地吞下去，感觉自己已变成河谷，一株枯柳爆炸的金色，投掷一只不停分娩天空的子宫，听木栅栏在风中呼啸，被钉死才拦住日子。到达水和雪湿漉漉的相似性，沉溺等在这儿。小酒馆絮絮叨叨的未来锁着门，一城市的他端着冷了的杯子，像个被栽种的呼吸。走得更远，埋进老铁桥的骸骨，不可能更远。大葱暗红锈蚀的灌木逼入窗户，阳光鬼魅的一亮，提示他头上定居的阴沉沉的水位。将死的风景到了，黑暗中拆散的 孤悬的台阶到了。
Die vorige Übersetzung des vorigen Gedichtes war übrigens von Karin Beetz und die jetzige ist von Jan Wagner. Wanderer. Mögen die Goldfische singen von Aufstieg und Fall der Stadt, die Schwäne am Ufer im Buch des Gefieders blättern und Mädchen mit Spiegeln nachahmen oder auch nicht. Ist der Wanderer doch erfüllt vom Klang des Winds. Eine pechschwarze Straße leitet ihn zu diesem Sumpfgebiet, wo die Füße versinken, die Ufer ein üppiges Grün, dem bitterster Winter vertraut ist. Nach dem Regen kauert das Gras auf gebrochenen Knien, eine Wolke denkt sich die Finsternis aus. Der Horizont sieht ihn schwanken zwischen hell und dunkel, worauf die Nacht entsteht, in der die Wildgans ruft und ruft. In diesem Prozess des Vergessens spürt er, wie das Tal ihn langsam schluckt, wie er längst Tal geworden ist. Eine hohle Weide, die endlos Himmel gebiert, eine Explosion von Gold. Er hört den Holzzaun heulen im Wind. So an den Tod genagelt, dass kein Tag vergeht, zuletzt das gemeinsame Nass von Blut und Wasser, wo das Ertrinken droht. Eine Bar, in der man von Zukunft schwätzt, mit verriegelter Tür. Und er, die gesamte Stadt, hält ein kaltes Glas, als habe der Atem Wurzeln geschlagen. Geht weiter, um im Skelett einer alten Eisenbrücke gestattet zu werden, geht, bis es kaum mehr möglich scheint. Rostige, blutrote Büsche bersten durchs Fenster. Eine geisterhafte Sonne scheint, markiert den gestiegenen Pegel über Kopf. Die versunkene Landschaft ist hier im Dunkel wie eine einsam schwebende Stufe, ist nirgendwo anders als hier.
Jan Wagner, do you hear his name, a poet? Yeah, well, you should. His poetry is extremely musical, therefore a great challenge to the translator. But we did exchange translations, and my Chinese translation of his gift, did you hear it? It's a terribly challenged, difficult poem, but my poems, let's say, faced the challenge and made also Jan Wagner's original, but in Chinese. And I hope later, in another way, we can show that to you. Yeah. Okay, continue that. For me, everyone in this time walked inside of her or his own exile. And poetry is an active exile based on the awareness. Therefore, to me, that is the exile with the extreme meaning. Exile equally means question, to question. And Qu Yuan, the poet, Chinese poet, made a question to heaven. And we ourselves has to make our own question to the heaven. And this is also a title of my book, published in Taiwan. And my poetry actually quite often gave people the feeling about the surrealist style. But I'm not interested about the surrealist technique. I'm interested about how to discover the deep reality. The poetical means deep, the depth of thinking and the depth of language.
So my fourth question, what is the ethic of depth? In 2012, I received this fellowship of Wissenschaft Kolleg in Berlin, and we turned down the beautiful home in London and packed everything and moved to Berlin. So many suitcases, and on the road again, and it reminded me the 10 years of memory of exile or on the road after Tiananmen Square. And that time, actually even in my dream, I held a suitcase and stood on the platform of the station. And my wife, when she every time packing and crying, so it sounds really sad. But at the same time, I read the Nabokov's memoir, which titled Speaking Memory. Did anyone read it? The professor? Yes. A great book. It's the great book, Speaking Memory. Please find it. And this book reminds me one important thing. Nabokov, actually among those very first generation of writers in exile in the 20th century, after the so-called Russian Revolution in 1917. And Nabokov's father was even murdered in Berlin on the street, and is buried in the Russian cemetery near Tiger Airport. I just went to visit 2 weeks ago there. So the book, on one side, it was extremely heavy. The experience, the memory, the writing, it was so painful. But at the same time, the book was also extremely light. If you know, Nabokov actually was a very famous specialist of butterfly. And therefore, every page, you feel, almost see the beautiful butterfly fly there. And most beautiful one was the Nabokov's writing style. And this heavy side and the light side make a great balance in the book. And after all, I must recognize the lightness represent this attitude of literature, look down and transcendent of this heavy reality. I must write a poem. So in that case, I wrote a poem and simply titled Butterfly Berlin, which link with Nabokov, link with Russian Revolution so-called background, link with myself and Chinese experience, link with all our situation today. And if you paid a little attention about my Chinese reading, hopefully you will recognize the rhyme arranged in the poem, which is like the soul link back to the classical Chinese poetry, but different from them. It's the transformation of the soul of the musical, the musics in the poetry, but different from the traditional form. Okay, I read a poem for you.
蝴蝶，柏林。父亲的墓地被更多墓地深深盖住，塌下来的石头像云，夯实的重量里，一只薄翼意外细出，一跳一跳找到你，当你还英俊细长，着迷于花朵摇荡的小扇子。公园中器官烫伤器官的吻，
空气的阻力也得学。墙死死按住彩绘的肩膀，暮色垂落，反衬小小明艳的一跃。当你的心惊觉这一瞬，一座城市已攥紧你绝命的籍贯，老没有词，只有扼在咽喉下的呻吟，才懂得反叛越纤细越极端，一种长出金黄斑点的力，推开水泥波浪，只比世界高1寸。海蝴蝶不奢望迁徙出恐怖，菲亚、塔马拉和父亲林林扛着身体，轻拍下一代流亡者入眠。灰烬的目录没有最远处，你骑在醒来就脱掉重量的住址上，树叶暗绿的灯罩挪近。当你不怕被一缕香攫住，成为那缕香，一路般递回一封信，打着海浪的邮戳，柏林。
Dieser Text ist von Joachim Sartorius übersetzt.
Sorry, I always forget to mention the translator's name. It's really bad. Yeah, I should do that. Yeah, sorry, you're really bad. Joachim Sartorius is a very old friend. He was the director of DAAD when I was the DAAD fellow in 1991. You were not born. Yeah. Okay, so it's very good to continue one long, beautiful journey from between the director and the writer, now poet and translator. Wonderful. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Schmetterling, Berlin. Der Kummer des Vaters sinkt vergraben in noch viel tieferen Kummer. Stein zermalmt wie Wolke. Ein großes, niederhaltendes Gewicht und darunter lugt überraschend ein zarter Flügel hervor. Flattert, dich zu finden, als du noch hübsch warst. Schlank, bezaubert von der sich wiegenden, sich Luft zufächelnden Blume im Park. Ein Organ, das ein anderes verbrennt, ein Kuss. Das Hindernis der Luft muss gelernt werden. Die Mauer drückt auf die farbenfroh bemalten Flügel. Die fallende Farbe des Abends löst ein kleines leuchtendes Geflatter aus. Wenn dein Herz dieses Augenblicks inne wird, hält die Stadt deine uralte Herkunft fest an sich, dein schicksalhaftes Ende. Hohes Alter hat keine Worte, nur abgewürgtes Stöhnen. Zu wissen dann, der zierlichere Verrat ist der heftigere. Eine Kraft lässt den goldenen, gelben Augenfleck anschwellen, öffnet die Wellen aus Zement, nur ein Haar über der Erde schweben. Den Meeresschmetterling fällt nicht ein, den Schrecken hinter sich zu lassen. Er fliegt Tamara und der Vater, er flackert, trägt die Körper und wiegt tätschelnd die nächste Generation von Exilanten in den Schlaf. Der Gehalt der Asche hat keinen Horizont. Du lässt dich hier nieder und schüttelst beim Aufwachen das Gewicht des Hauses ab. Der dunkelgrüne Lampenschirm aus Blättern kommt näher. Wenn du nicht fürchtest, von einem faden Duft eingefangen zu werden, wirst du selbst dieser Duft werden und den Brief zurückbringen, den die Toten hinterließen, mit dem Siegel der Ozeanwellen. Berlin.
Well, to me, the whole word of international has no meaning. The depth is under everybody's feet. Everyone has a dictionary of your own thinking. And if you dig the earth under your feet, you will find it. And my Chinese dictionary of thought or thinking actually becoming the bridge to meet almost all different cultures and situations without difficulties. And the borders, the cultures, the language never stop this communication and exchange. With the great Arabic poet Adonis, and we actually singing the title of the concerto of 9/11's 2001 BC. Remember, it's not AD, but BC. This was his title, with one change from AD to BC. Whole time was included. With the very wonderful South African poet, Brandenbach, and we discuss and discover the sentence, poetry is our unique mother tongue. Actually, in the depths of poetry, way of the poetry thinking, all culture have been brought together. With the Russian poet we just mentioned, Vladimir Mikushevich, we talk about to put a mushroom into the cooking hall, which means the poetry has to be composed in the wonderful form, like cooking the mushrooms. And with the Slovenian poet, Aleš Steger, we made the elephant, the Chinese elephant, learn from the Slovenian mouse, which is rediscovered or excited the Chinese writing in dialect, which does not exist, but learning from the 2 million people in Slovenia. And all this on and on with like Jan Wagner, with Joachim Satros, now we have a lot of exchange between the Chinese and German poets. So, anyway, after all, my fifth question, how to build the depth of language to prove the depth of thinking. To me, the spiritual crisis of human being never been so deep like today. Therefore, the importance and even necessary of poetry never been so clear like today. The concept of avant-garde in the contemporary Chinese poetry is impossible to be built on the linear concept of time. After the big shaking of cultural revolution in China during the 20th century, and the time like collapsed from all directions to our head. Therefore, the avant-garde in our poem has to be addressed at the depth, the deep layer. The depth actually opened up all direction and bring all direction becoming the thinking sources and to create the works which is different from everywhere. The depth excited new and forced the way of writing has to be new. The contemporary situation of our human the difficult situation of our mind is not means to give up
the form of poetry, to let poetry becoming a cheap, like propaganda or slogan and that kind of tour. Oppositely, we have to seeking and pursuit of the form of poetry. Because it's not only the form of poetry. The form of poetry means the form of our mind and form of the humanity. And so that is actually the stand where our mind to based on. The next poem actually is without the political theme on the surface. The theme is a little bit even decadent or naughty. But please pay attention on the form and the musical nature of the poem. The three stanzas with the three different rhymes, and that design, special design of the poem is a link with the special poetic. And this is what I call the formalist tradition of the contemporary Chinese poetry. It's different from the classical Chinese poetry, which is the all poets kicking the same football game with the same rule of the judgment. We have to design the judgment for each football game of each poem, the poetry, but we have to kick the ball into the goal. I hope that could be a case to show what I call the poetical ethics of depth. And this poem is based on a short kind of stories. Again, back to London, my home in London, and one day I bought a bunch of purple tulip flower. And when I put the tulip flower in the vase in the dining table, in the dining room, where the blue wallpapers around there, and when the flower getting rotten, and suddenly I saw the color on the petals and leaves getting even more interesting, even more deeper, and even more literally shining, and even the form of the flower a little bit turning like dancing. So then I wrote this poem here. Again, it's translated by Jan Wagner, and I gave the poem to him because this musical arrangement, I hope he should be the good or correct person to bring that poem into German. Is that possible? We read this one in German first. Therefore, I can, people don't hear my Chinese for too long, and then they can enjoy the music. Yeah. Great, thank you so much.
Yes, definitely. So I should remark, as Yang already said, this poem has been translated by Jan Wagner, German poet, and you should know that he obviously attempts to transform, to translate by reproducing the rhyme scheme. Am I right? So he reproduces the rhymes.
Yes.
So this form is important, and I'm trying to stress the rhymes, but I should warn you that the intervals between rhyme words are quite long, so you have to listen carefully.
Okay.
Nacht im Palast der Purpurtulpen. Adagio. Hier im Serai, wo jede Nacht aus Mondlicht, Jade, Perlenstrang besteht, alles imaginär. Stell dir den Strauß vom Blau einer Tapete, die Konkubine vor, und unter ihrem Kleid die Fülle Schnee. Schnee, der besessen werden will, ein Körper, der sich dreht. Kristallen langsam, in sich selbst hinein in einen Tanz. Ein Tulpenstrauß, der leuchtet im Vergehen, jede Selbstliebe verschmäht. Ein Purpurflüstern, das als Hauch gesprochen werden muss, das, während er die Blüten drückt, nur ihm allein zusteht. Ein Tropfen Purpurmilch. Die Konkubine der Lippen hart, bis alle Welt ins Brennen der Gefäße übergeht. Hier im Serai wird Feuer wie ein derbes Zungenspiel entfacht. Die Spitze leckt die leere Haut. Das Grün der Mitternacht, wie Blattwerk, das an ihrem Fuß sich angesammelt hat. Und seine Liebe ist ein Regenguss, aus jeder Richtung zugedacht. Der Blume wässert diese, bis die Purpurschale ihre Brustwarze sich füllt, als Rache an der Zeit. Jedes Pigment von tiefster Meerespracht. In dieser Nacht bewegt ein Tulpenstrauß sich von Sopran zu Mezzo-Sopran. Hat der Tyrann der Schönheit, der Ästhetik des Verwelkens Platz gemacht? Ihr flüchtiges Parfum schenkt sie nur ihm. Nur er darf kosten. Das Seidenlicht gewinnt an Dringlichkeit, zerfällt der Purpursacht. Hier im Serai phosphoresziert das Licht im Blütenstempel, ist bereit, des Körpers Lust zu dirigieren, ihn zu spielen, gleich zu welcher Jahreszeit, ein Loch zu weiten, eingeschnitten, den modellierten Tag der Konkubine. Blau der Tapete wie ein kranker Geist, der all die Schmerzen der Vergangenheit vernäht und einmal nur in jeder Blüte Bissspuren der Stunden, um endlos nachzudunkeln, ewig frisch und zart, das nachtbestickte Fleischeskleid. Anfangs war Purpur, breitete sich aus wie Milch, ein Tropfen, langsam vertilgt vom All. Das blinzelt angesichts von seiner Fiebrigkeit. Er starrt, schenkt so der Konkubine eine dunkelste Grammatik, die Vase wie ein Wort, die Hände hüten sie zu zweit.
紫玉金宫，慢板的一页，后宫里一夜，总有月光、玉阶和珠帘，却都是想象。一束花衬着壁纸的蓝，想象妃子的紫衣下，一堆雪在坍塌，急急等待被占用的雪，用结晶慢慢转身。 每分钟向内卷曲着，慢慢舞蹈。一束郁金香璀璨的衰败，脱下一场自恋。一种紫色的耳语，必须喘息着说，只对那人说。当他重重碾压着花瓣，一滴紫色的奶，像妃子急急等待被吸尽的，想着。 全世界就拥进一根滚烫的脉管。后宫里的火，总有舌头反般的顽皮，被修剪的尖舔到皮肤的空，午夜之绿，绿如片片堆叠在妃子脚踝处的叶子。那人的宠爱，一场来自所有方向的沐浴。 浇淋它的花，乳头的紫玉小碗斟满了，报复一个时间，大海沉积在色素里。一束郁金香，一夜从女高音滑入女中音，今夜霸道之美，对称着流逝的诗意。妃子，只为那人保存的幽香，只交给他把玩。 紫色的慢慢粉碎，丝光停不住时，后宫里总有闪烁成一个蕊的灵光，一根针指挥着肉体四季被演奏的欲望， 一种镂空的剪裁，镂空至妃子的生死，壁纸蓝蓝，如以此缝合所有伤痛的狂想。只一次，花影中日子咬下的牙印，无限发暗，这夜色无限鲜嫩，刺绣到身上。原初那色，紫像滴慢慢晕开的奶，慢慢被宇宙吸收，纵容那人的黄，那么黄，凝视中赐给妃子一个黑禁的语法。当花瓶像个词，圆圆贴着手掌。Anyway, to sums up the whole thing this evening, for me, is A, the poet is a questioner. B, poetry is our unique mother tongue. C, poetry leading us come back to our own selves. D, or fourth, the destination is so far away, but at the same time is so close, refusing to let this poem sink into that indifferent beauty. Thank you very much.
For your wonderful talk. Also thanking our friend Frank for wonderful readings. And we still have a few, about 20 or 25 minutes left to, no. We won't let you go so easily. Are there, we have now such an opportunity, we can communicate our poets on poetry, on the meaning of life, or the relationship of poets and poetry to our modern difficult world.
Sorry, I didn't speak in German. And, anyway, I hope the young listeners.
No, it was perfect.
Really? Okay.
Or I think you could understand, right?
Yes. Okay. My dear.
Oh, please.
Good.
Yes. Thank you very much for your talk. And I can't understand Chinese, but it was very interesting how you spoke to the poems. And
You made me very happy. Much happier. Okay, thank you.
And I have the question you talked about that you see a deep spiritual crisis in humanity now, like it was has never been before, so deep like now.
Yeah.
And in the poetry you see, or I asked which role plays poetry in this crisis, and how can we get out of this crisis?
It was a question or not? Well, it's we always said that poetry on one side is so rare as in the world, but on the other side, the poetry is actually also too many in the world because so many people write poetry or something. So for me, I really love to see the poem which has this profound, worried experience in the life, and then find the creative way to describe that in the writing. And so everywhere, when I read Chinese poetry, when I was in Russia to do the translation with Russian poet, and all the poets here in Germany, I always keeping this idea in mind, whether it's
find an important poetry or poet, or it's only a kind of a decoration. Because the commercialized the world, it's not only making the industry productions becoming commercial, but also making the literature becoming commercial too. And the poetry, for me, I wanted to see the necessity of the writing, but very often the poetry was just decoration, just something you read, you know, there's been writing all the time, everywhere, and so it was no that kind of importance. Yeah, so I hope to see something unique. Yeah.
Yeah, fine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but for obvious reason I changed position, so that I can ask.
Why don't you ask a question here?
You know, it's better for me. You know. Now, my question is, how do you assess the transformation of contemporary Chinese poetry over the past 2, maybe 3 decades? So I remember listening to your poetry when I was a student in 1991, probably, and I think that during this time, of course, contemporary poetry in China has tremendously changed. Society has changed. But listening to your poems now, I thought of basically the fact that contemporary Chinese poetry is very much international poetry in a way. It has changed. International poetry, not national.
Yeah, international. Okay.
So would you basically agree with that? And if yes, how would you describe this process of transformation?
Very nice question. Actually, this interlinked layers are very, actually, it's almost like the nature of contemporary Chinese, let's say, culture, but also like a reality and society. Actually, I've been called the so-called one of the misty poets, which I think you'll see me quite clear, not really misty. But on the other side, that time when we start our writing at the end of the 1970s and beginning of the 1980s, we actually been totally locked in China, in Chinese political situation, even the Chinese literature. It's all inside. And then there was almost the whole 80s have this strong desire to open up and to not only reading, learning, but almost eating and swallow everything we can find, you know, from the international poetry or something. And that time was, let's say, tried our best to open up and to see the international, what's happening there, in the literature or something. But again, like what I said before, the journey actually is always in a double directions. The more you open yourself toward to the outside, and actually that means the more awareness has been built inside of yourself, and also about the background, about the root, about tradition. So the outsider, the insider, the outside and inside is always deeply linked. So like my own experience, let's say after 1989, now surprisingly, I've been living outside China for 30 years. Very often when I even talk to my Chinese colleagues, everybody says that after we talking in Chinese, after I speaking, well, they feel very purely Chinese, and they always question, were you really outside of China? and how could you speaking so purely and communicate without any problem? But after we come back, I actually maybe I was exiled from China, but I never exiled from Chinese language. As the writing, I have been always insider of the contemporary Chinese poetry. And one of the things I like to do mostly is to bring this very international experience, but back to building up the awareness about the Chinese language and literature, including the deep introspections of the Chinese tradition, and to bring the inner elements, wonderful elements of the tradition, but into the contemporary and creative version. So what we read here, a poem, seems like the arrangement of the form. You can even almost call it neoclassical style. But this, as I said, that the avant-garde in the Chinese meaning is not only point to the so-called future, it's also including to liberate the past and the tradition. So that means to making a real mature literature in Chinese is the main goal. Is both international, which is open to the all different language and cultures, but is also come back to the Chinese root and to make this growing in a nicer way. Yeah.
I still have one completely different question about the last poem you read, which was, maybe everybody could get it, there were a lot of erotic motifs, and as you spoke about tradition and the rising perhaps influence of traditional poetry on contemporary poetry, I wonder if I was right, because when reading the poem and the translation, I had to think of such lascive poetry like late Tang poetry, Lirik, this poem is very erotic and very hermetic and has a lot of pictures and a lot of atmosphere. I was reminded of, but I'm not sure if I'm wrong or right. Is this a kind of poetry that plays with the poem we just read here?
I'm very happy you asked questions about this poem, because I didn't mention when we talked here. This poem is among in the collection of actually erotic poems, the collection of erotic poems. And I use the word erotic. Actually, it's a very sexy poems. And this one, it was maybe the most softest one, the easiest one within the book. But I wrote the whole collection of these erotic poems with a very clear concept, with the idea, which is, if you remember, not only China, but almost universally in the whole time and almost all country, if you look the list of censorship, it's not always the political subject on the censorship. It's always the number one was on sex. By the censorship of sex, then actually almost every dictators made the censorship of other things becoming legal, becoming reasonable, becoming correct. This is why to write this collection of the erotic poems, for me it was clearly proposed to attack
this very first thing in the censorship. And therefore, from there to bring him through to on the all other layers of censorships. So that is on one side, yes, beautiful, formalist, and the sounds like a classical, but at the same time, it's with a very clear proposed idea in the classical, in the contemporary time. So in this case, we are well, luckily we have really the sources from many different directions, and yes, it's not wrong. People will somehow remember or be reminded about the great tradition of the erotical, beautiful, decadent poetry in the 1,000 years of Chinese history in the past. They've been forgotten, but I want to say, now we have this great tradition. But on the other side, it's composed today. And so yeah, that's almost like a fighting to the all different friends. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your talk, and as Angelika already said, also for your reading of your own words, which was very impressive, even though I don't understand Chinese either. And you already answered kind of half of my question, which is you said that international is a hollow word, and then you explained something about the depth under one's feet, and now, as you answered Herr Kraushaar's first question and mentioned this idea of a journey in a double direction, I think I understand how those two ideas are juxtaposed, but still, why do you describe international as a hollow word? What is hollow about the word international?
Again, a good question, and well, because we have been used this word of international very often and somehow too easily. And what's exactly mean of that word? Only is that means like, okay, I'm looking like a Chinese, and it looks like German, and we are in the same room, and we are international. Do we really know each other? Or we actually only see a strange face? Not only you, even my friend Joachim Sartorius, and when I was the DAAD fellow, and my house was in the number 9 Mommsenstraße in Berlin, and he lived in the Mommsenstraße number 7, and we come and go party all the time. He always holding the 2 bottles, come to the party, wonderful time of drinking, but I have to say, we do not know each other until I have been translating his poem and he translating my poem. Only by this way, words by word, sentence by sentence, poem by poem, and I see the way of thinking of Joachim, and he also saw mine too. And in this case, when I talk to Joachim, now I can find a much profound layer or meeting point between us. So, international for me, if only it's only has meaning when the profound layers of different culture could be brought together and meet and exchange together. And then this international has meaning. Without this profound meeting, and then international is a whole word. And this is also the, let's say, I learned this from my own poem. When I saw that my own Newton apple in London, it was a strange feeling. I thought, how could me as a Chinese can feel on that branch of that tree there will be a last apple in November? How could I can even feel this? Then there was an apple, and then I feel, oh my God, the relationship between me and this place becoming something different. It's not only one of the places I passing through or passing by. It's the place somehow becoming my own local. But how could I got a foreign local where I was not growing up there, I have no relative there, I know only some people but not so many there, but how could that becoming my own local? That was the first question, actually brought me try to open up or discover the deeper layers inside the local. And then I wrote the whole collection of poetry called Lian poems. It's in English translation. And in the book, I try to use the images as local as possible. But the more images in the local way, the more this international experience had been shown up in the writing. Yeah, so that's again like a good learning through the poetry.
So thank you for your talk, and during your talk you showed on iPhone, and I'm interested on your iPhone, Apple iPhone.
Apple phone.
Yes. So my question is about the media, and you mentioned different aspects and functions of poetry, and so my question: are you present on social media, and what do you think of this connection? And it's actually so now poetry has been spread through social media, and what's your position to it, and also in connection to Ai Weiwei, who is also very important in this. So what do you think about it?
Actually, you're touching some very important point, especially linked with the contemporary Chinese situation. Of course, global, but the Chinese example is very, very interesting because since the political control is still there, the old version of the official publications and that way is continuing. But at the same time, this internet, including the mobile phone, well, no matter how to be Apple, everything, and actually give this opportunity of so-called self-media. The self-media in Chinese, maybe you heard the WeChat, like Twitter, but more than Twitter. It's in content much more text and pictures like catalog and something, but more than 8 million people use that every day, and you cannot actually imagine how many poets send their poems and making up their groups and publishing their so-called 公众号, how to say 公众号 in English, the public number, kind of a public number. You could make like a little publisher, unbelievably huge number. In 2012, I've been asked to be the chief editor of a website. It's called the Arts
BJ, Beijing, and it's run by a Chinese visual artist. And I said, okay, well, why not? But what do you want me to do? And he said, well, can do anything. It's a website, our own website, can do anything. Then I said, okay, why don't we make one international but Chinese poetry prize on the website and open to everybody. Any poem written in Chinese. And that time, even just 7 somehow years ago, and there was no one, me, but including those juries who were quite well-known Chinese poets, no one expected within 1 year, more than 80,000 poems flooded into the website. And even more surprisingly, many of them, more than half of them, were really good poems. They are not really like, okay, high middle school students just sent. No, read it and then you'll find them, they've been writing for a long time. And they already passed this, we call the prehistory period of writing. And there was, but again, almost all those poets, we never heard their names. And then even more surprisingly, when we carefully read the poems, we discover that most of the poems was written by the migrant workers poets, which means in the daytime they work in this very hard the factories like Apple phones and so many of them. But then after they come back to from the work, and when maybe other people drinking or falling sleeping or whatever they face to all their old computer and wrote words and communicate who knows which corner of the world and exchange their poems. And this migrant worker poets or poetry becoming now a very big phenomenon in the world. Because in the whole history, we know those working class people and they were the part of the machines, they working but without voice. And suddenly through the internet, through this, maybe now the mobile phones and this social medias, their voice hugely came out. And this is something extremely new for the Chinese reality, but also Chinese culture. In my way, back to the link with the Chinese poetry tradition, the direct link between the very first hand of life and the very first hand of language has been reconnected directly. And this gives the poetry real warm blood and soul. And so in this case, I'm quite happy these opportunities for people to express their voice. So, of course, it's could be seen as the difficult situation, like I mentioned before, but there's always the possibilities for people, and just based on how you can find yourself to use it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we have just a couple minutes left. Maybe last question.
Very unfortunate occasion because my question is
really wonderful.
deliberately. Thank you.
Is deliberately stupid. You've been talking about the death under your feet and the different layers of death. Now, I suppose you need some kind of historical training or knowledge to realize how deep the area is under your feet. And otherwise, how could you possibly sense it? For example, in a lecture hall like this one.
Questions or something?
Yeah, this was a question.
Okay.
I didn't mean phrasing it wrongly. You've been talking about death, death under your feet, referring probably to a precise location like this lecture hall. On the other hand, I suppose that to feel the death properly, you need some kind of historical training or at least knowledge. Hence my question. How can you feel the death?
Well, if you're asking a tree about the depth is actually inside of the life. I don't want to say the depth is always in the other way, the other place. You know, when we talk about political situation, yes, we can say exile from China, from Iraq, from some strange place. But when we realize, actually we ourselves, even especially the younger people, and actually are in exile, and if you're asking them which direction of your life, can you tell me what's the future you think your life goes to? I think they maybe feel even more confusing than we are, so I think to find or to feel the depth is to questioning oneself, and there's no need even to only look the other place. So in that case, I have to say that you almost, or I feel, you're almost impossible to understand the depths or the difficulties or whatever of the others without to understand the difficult and depths inside of yourself. And this is the dictionary. You can communicate with others, but not the other way around. You only feel pity of, oh, sorry, those the people being killed in the bomb, it's sad. But why? You know, and we are in a safe way. But is that actually only the problem there, or actually the problem here? Yeah, I think that is everywhere, especially everywhere we stand here. Yeah.
Okay, so that was a very deep answer to a deep question.
Oh, too long, I mean.
Yeah. But something we can ponder on our dreams, or later this evening during our talks. Thank you all for being here. Especially thanks to Lian for sharing his thoughts and his poems.
Thank you.
Wonderful melodies with us. And you all know this was only the second series, or the second talk of our lecture series. There will be more in the